They say the truth will set you free, but first, it will break you open. Today's guest has lived through that breaking and now walks the path of protector, witness, and warrior. Today, you're going to hear part one of my two-part conversation with Jerome Elam, the president and CEO of the Trafficking in America Task Force. He's maybe one of the most inspiring people I've had the honor of speaking to. If you're looking to hear from a real-life superhero, someone fighting the most evil people walking the earth today, then hang tight. You're not going to believe what Jerome has overcome. You will be astounded by his story and inspired by the work he is doing today to protect vulnerable children. And don't forget to tune in next Wednesday for the powerful conclusion of this conversation. Before we begin, a quick note. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered a substitute for professional advice regarding your personal circumstances. The views expressed are solely those of myself and my guests. Also, today's episode contains sensitive content, including discussions of trauma, suicide, and child sexual abuse. If these topics may be distressing to you, please prioritize your well-being and consider whether this is the right time to listen. Resources for support are available in our show notes. Please take care of yourself. Okay, let's get started. Good morning and welcome, Jerome.
Thank you.
I want to jump right in by reading some of your many credentials. You are the president and CEO of the Trafficking in America Task Force, a nonprofit organization dedicated to combating human trafficking through education, advocacy, and survivor support. The task force works with state, local, and congressional lawmakers and trains law enforcement, medical, and mental health professionals to bring an end to human trafficking. You're the recipient of the Award for Courage, presented by the National Council of Jewish Women, and received the U.S. Attorney General's Alliance Lifetime Achievement Award. You are a staff writer and columnist for the community's digital news and a special advisor to the Utah Attorney General. You have also been chosen as one of New York's new abolitionists. You are a U.S. Marine Corps veteran. Thank you for your service. But before all of that, between the ages of 5 and 12, you were a remarkably resilient and courageous young boy, a boy who survived a childhood that can only be described as horrific. Your personal journey from victim to survivor to warrior advocate has been featured in numerous platforms, including the Discovery Channel's documentary series, The Clown and the Candyman, which explores the stories of serial killers and pedophile rings in the 1970s. You are a regular speaker around the world. Your influence extends not just to the general public, but legislators, political organizations, and the media. You have been instrumental in raising awareness on human trafficking and helping to get legislation passed in the U.S. and internationally. Jerome, you have been immensely generous in sharing your story on numerous outlets, including podcasts such as this one. Thank you for being here with me today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm truly honored to be here today.
I want to quote something you said to explain the horror you survived. You wrote, quote, "I was born into a world of dysfunction. My mother, Marie, was an alcoholic, pregnant at 17, and her life was held firmly in the grip of chaos. When you were only 5, your mother brought home a man. It started well, but then he began molesting you, and then he used you for child pornography, and ultimately sexually trafficked you through the pedophile ring he belonged to. You have written, and again I quote, "The first time I was given drugs and alcohol, handcuffed and raped for hours by doctors, lawyers, accountants, and anyone who would pay to ravage my innocence. Even though you were so little at the time, you were still trying to get out of the situation." And you go on to say, "I had tried to tell at least 10 people that I was being trafficked, and my reward for this was having 3 of my ribs broken." I know you share unflinchingly about your history, but as I was preparing for this show, I felt conflicted about how much detail I wanted to go into. And on the one hand, I wanted to be above all else respectful and thoughtful about what we discussed, but I was also aware of wanting to avoid any kind of sensationalism. But while I was poring over your many interviews and your writing, it occurred to me that telling your story honestly has not just been a pivotal part of your healing, but also in the advocacy work that you do. And I was just wondering if you could share your thoughts on this.
I think you're exactly right. I think that, you know, uh, I've really turned, my trauma into something beautiful, and I've been really struck by how impactful I've been able to be in advocating, speaking. Did a week of training in Ukraine in 2020. I trained judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement in Ukraine for a week. And during that time period, there was legislation that was being proposed to protect children online. And had been stalled, in getting approval. I came in for a week and educated them about, online safety and about how kids are at risk. And, I was able, through putting my heart on my sleeve, to get them to understand just how at risk kids were and to be able to get that legislation passed through. And as my supervisor told me at the time, she said, "Look, you were so effective because you're a man, a veteran, and a survivor. So as a man and a veteran, you're directly mirror those who are in power in Eastern Europe." And so I was able to really, break through that wall and get them to understand just how anybody could be at risk. Doesn't matter who you are, you can still be at risk of being exploited in traffic.
I'm so inspired by everything in your story, which we're going to get into. But right off the bat, as I'm hearing you talk, is that this is what leadership looks like, is you're using a part of your vulnerability and your experience, not just your functional experience. Obviously, you're a very smart person, but you have the wisdom to understand how to use those aspects of yourself to influence people, to bring people along. And that's true leadership. And I think what makes you so effective in your role.
Thank you. And I just want to say, and I love that you mentioned vulnerability, because I have to say, as I often do, that I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for a female survivor that taught me that as a man, I could be vulnerable and powerless as a child and still be a man. Because one of the things that we see is that male survivors or male victims of sexual violence or sexual abuse, they have 14 times or 32 times the suicide rate of the norm. They have, 50% the rate of incarceration of the norm. So for males in particular, we just have a very hard time, getting away from that, being controlled by our egos and being able to talk about things that have happened to us. And again, what kind of spurred me to be here and be an advocate was Jerry Sandusky and his trial. And I think that, there was something that just kind of struck a chord to me that said, you really need to go public with this and talk about it. So, I was very fortunate that, I wrote an article that I sent out to the news outlets, and it was picked up in the Washington Times. And they said, "Well, we can publish this on a one-time basis." And I said, "Great. We can't pay you." I said, "No problem." So, and the article did so well, they offered me a column. I think, my initial motivation was anger at how many children were being abused and trafficked and how it was still happening every single day. So I got angry and wrote this article. And then, when you put yourself out there publicly, you're like, what did I just do?
Yeah.
But I found that it was the best thing I'd ever done in my life, because I began to get contacted by people from the UK, men and women, UK, from the Middle East, from Africa, India, all over, saying, "You just told my story." So that for me was a real godsend, and I was really grateful to be able to have that kind of outreach. So I think the important thing for us as survivors is to understand our value in this world, and that we have to overcome that feeling of worthlessness that we are subjected to when we're trafficked, and begin to understand our value. And I really find that it doesn't matter where you are in the world, that we all suffer trauma in the same way and our hearts all feel pain in the same way. I've just been grateful to stand in the gap for victims and survivors who feel like they can't speak out.
I say on this show a lot that we're both the writer and the main character of our lives, and that by reclaiming our story, we empower the part of ourselves that didn't have power when we were younger and typically when things have been done to us. Your story I see as a hero's journey, except that you weren't just fighting one dragon, you were fighting many dragons, and the odds were against you. You're defenseless and outnumbered, but you couldn't be broken. And though you would have been too little to give yourself credit at the time, your inner warrior was just growing and becoming stronger and stronger. And then, of course, at the age of 12, after 7 years of unspeakable abuse, you came to feel your life was, I think you quoted, an abyss of worthlessness and pain, and had tried to take your own life. Luckily, you woke up in an emergency room to the sound of a nurse arguing with doctors, and she could clearly see that you were had been a victim of abuse and needed immediate intervention. I'm wondering what it felt like to have someone stand up for you after so many years of being let down and ignored by probably every adult that had seen you. Do you recall what that felt like?
Honestly, it was like a dream because I think that, when you come from a situation where you're being exploited or trafficked, you have, I mean, hope is the only thing you have. And I held on to hope the entire time. But I think that trust is the other issue that becomes very difficult. So I've kind of held my breath. I'd been praying for this for so long. It was kind of like a dream. Over time, I began to accept that I had fully escaped this. I think even as adults, survivors of exploitation and abuse, you can really look over your shoulder and
Mhm.
feel like, am I really free of this? You're still in fear that you're going to get pulled back into it. That at that particular moment, that God had really spoken to me and said, you know, this is it. This is where your life begins over again and you begin to live my purpose. And so I just had this unshakable direction and confidence in my life that I knew what I had to do. And it just seems like sometimes it seems like it was yesterday, and sometimes it seems like it was like a long time ago. For me, as long as I'm still doing the work and being a voice, I feel like I'm fulfilling my purpose. There's so much suffering out there. I want to go back to something that you briefly mentioned as well. I spent 25 years with a trauma therapist working through what happened to me. And one of the things that I did was I would often sit in that chair and say, why am I here? And so many kids or children around me didn't make it. Came down to I had one person in my life who was a great aunt who showed me unconditional love for a period of time. And so that became the tether that bound me to want to survive, want to live, want to go on. What we see, Mary, when we look at victims and survivors, the ones who have this vacuum of love that tend to struggle the most. And so I was very fortunate to have that one person. Thank God, for my wife and my kids because they show me unconditional love. That's the one thing that we strive for in this work, in anti-trafficking work, is to get these victims and survivors to look in the mirror and love who they see, teach them how valuable they are in this world. And, we just keep going until they really understand that they're going to have happiness and peace and that the past is the past and today is a new day. It's a blank page and you start over again.
Wow, I didn't know that about that aunt. It makes me think, as I often do, as I'm kind of going both sides of what it feels like to be in a certain situation, and then what it feels like to be a safe other, is that we underestimate sometimes the impact that we can have on others. And I do want to talk to you a little bit about what we can all do, but it occurs to me that the kindness that that person showed you, even though it was minimal in scope of everything else that you were feeling, being that you were so strong, you really held on to it. It was so special that I could imagine, each one of us when we encounter people in the world, and it could be a stranger, just being an act of kindness, or maybe volunteering or getting involved with people who are in trouble directly. We can't imagine how valuable that could be for someone else, how that could be a lifeline, how that could be a thread that is a major asset in their healing later on down the line.
Absolutely. And one thing that we have to understand, Mary, is that familial trafficking, people trafficked by their families, that can be about 30% of victims because there are cases documented of 3 generations of a family trafficking kids. And that can be a very difficult form of trauma to overcome because in essence, I had to divorce my family. I had to just walk away from them because even at the periphery, you know, it's either ascribe to this kind of narrative they were giving that everything was normal, or you were persona non grata, yet they didn't want anything to do with you. So I really had to walk away. So in that case, I really like to emphasize with victims and survivors that family doesn't have to be biological, it can be operational. You can choose who you have in your life, and you can choose those who are healthy and are looking out for you and your well-being, as opposed to those related by blood. Because when you come from these dysfunctional settings, especially, it can be very hard to break free from that. And I think, and unfortunately, I describe myself, as a young man, as a chaos junkie, because there's this really great book that helped me. It's called Getting the Love You Want by Harville Hendricks. And it teaches you how to get into relationships. But one of the things that it talks about is the concept of an imago. And what that means is that the people you encounter as a child shape your choices as an adult. And so unless you break that cycle, you're really going to be just doomed to never find happiness. So I knew I had to break that cycle. And thankfully through therapy, I kind of broke that cycle and kind of moved on. Um, because for victims especially, it can sometimes be the devil versus the ones you don't know. So you can just get into these chaotic situations over and over again until you break that cycle. You're never really going to find that, be self-actualized and know what happiness is. So I just was so grateful that, I was able to kind of break free of that and really just, end that cycle that had been perpetuated for so long in my family.
And I think this is a great call out, again, just to continue to emphasize the courage, and all trauma survivors are courageous and that's what they have to carry every day. But to step forward and break the intergenerational trauma as you're describing and just saying it stops with me and I'm going to do the work. I didn't ask for this. I now carry the burden of this and I'm going to be the one that stops it, and I'm going to do it through therapy and work, holding myself accountable and not using any of that past as an excuse. If anything, you've even raised the bar even higher
Yeah.
for yourself. I think I've said sometimes the familiar bad is often more appealing than unfamiliar good. And just because it just seems like this is normal, we gravitate to certain people or situations that feel like home, and people won't understand it, and we can reenact a certain dynamic or a certain challenge over and over again until we break through and understand it. In some ways we're still hoping, I think, in some ways, of fixing the original situation. And there is a part of wisdom that comes with, I can't change those people, but I can't settle, as you're saying, to accept their narrative or to accept certain conditions. I tend to have pretty high expectations in my relationships these days. There was a time where I had profoundly low expectations. And it took a long time to realize that what good was, what even healthy was, no less, the subconscious belief that I deserve better. And this is what it should look and feel like. And I'm calling out a plug for trauma therapy as well. People who have experienced trauma really need a very special type of therapy to help navigate many of the things that you're discussing here.
Yeah, it's like an onion. You peel back the layers as you go along. And one of the things I'll share with you and people watching this podcast is that there were many, many times in therapy over those 25 years, I would say, can't you make this go faster? Because I
Yes.
think that, you really want to overcome this, but, I think your mind, I mean, especially when you're victimized, as a child, it just takes your mind a long time to process. I will share that one of the biggest healing experience in my life was when my kids reached the age I was when I was exploited and trafficked. Because I mean, traffickers are very good, and predators are very good at making you feel like it's your fault. They always say, "Why did you make me do this to you?" Which is just sickening. But yeah, but you begin to realize at that point when your kids get to that age that as a child you were not physically able to do anything to stop what was happening to you. But I think until that point, you can really have that self-blame. So that really allowed me to get past and transcend that. It's always a work in progress. I tell people, I mean, there's still days that I feel the pain, I struggle, but through therapy with the tools and the support system, I'm able to get through that really quickly. I can't overstate the value of trauma therapy. We're gratefully progressing and learning more about how to help victims of exploitation and trafficking. But at that point, I was pretty much teaching my therapist
Yeah.
how to deal with someone who had been exploited and trafficked. And so 25 years were a lot of hard work, but I was very grateful to be able to, get past all this. And I think, those triggers can be pretty unforgiving. I always advocate for mental health and mental health professionals because we don't pay them enough. We don't give enough, support for people who need to get that therapy. You can't medicate a lot of this stuff away. You've got to work through it, in a chair talking about it. So I'm really grateful to have in my own work, we always put therapy out there as a choice because we don't want to force it upon people, but we tell people it's a choice that they can take. And I just always say how much has benefited me. But you have to get to that point where you want to get past it. You've got to choose that you want to take that first step on the healing path. And I will say unequivocally that that first step is the hardest. The rest are so much easier.
Yeah, I'm shaking my head. Everything you said, yes, 1,000%. And I'm the same way, having always wanted things to go faster. And of course, my coping mechanism, I love to intellectualize. I use my brain because I don't want to feel things. I try to think my way. I have, all these books. I'll read my way through it. And that's not the way through it. And I've been very, very lucky to have a brilliant trauma therapist. And he would often say, the slower you go, the faster you get there. And that might even mean slow in the progression of even choosing to enter therapy, as you're saying, is that this is about you participating. Certainly people who've had things happen to them against their will, you don't want to force anything. That's just a re-traumatizing. I want to shift gears and talk about trafficking a little bit. And you know so much about this. I learned a lot preparing for this episode. Even the term trafficking has evolved significantly, both legally and socially, in the last 20 years. It's used more precisely, but also more publicly, which might lead to some confusion or even dilution of its meaning in the media. So the official definition of trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act, in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person is under the age of 18. And so, just very simply, you're an adult, you've been forced, coerced, defrauded, or you're a minor, in which case you don't need to prove force or coercion. And you kind of hinted to this earlier. And I think it's a really important part of the story, is that minors cannot make informed decisions about some of these things. I was riveted, Jerome. I watched the documentary you were involved in, the Clown and the Candyman, and I think we could just spend the next 2 hours discussing it. But certainly one of the things that really stood out to me, and I think it speaks to how far we've come since the 70s, we were both young children, is I think the first is just, wow, the lack of infrastructure and systemic protections for children. Back then, there's no registry for sex offenders. There's really not an organized training of teachers and medical personnel. But the other thing that really struck me is that even when predators were caught, they received shockingly low convictions, or it was like a slap and back into the world. And then there was this very disturbing subtext, which was, it was they were 15. It was consensual. I think even the monster John Gacy had spoken that his experiences were consensual, and whether that means you were 15 and not 5, or a boy and not a girl, all of those things are really just excuses and ways of grifting victims and trying to almost make people feel more comfortable that this isn't as horrible as it actually is.
Exactly right. I mean, it doesn't matter. If you're a day from 18, you're still a minor. And so you can still be exploited. You don't have the experience, the knowledge, the confidence to understand what's happening to you. So, irregardless, as long as you're a minor, you're still considered to be vulnerable in that way. I'm an expert witness in the state of Florida in trafficking and grooming, and I testified in a murder trial in South Florida for a young man who was, in the process of being raped and sexually assaulted. Just, the guy was twice his size, couldn't get him off of him, and defended himself, and ended up actually killing the guy. But then he unfortunately ran, and was in jail for 3 years. Before he came to trial, I was called in to testify, and he was set free. So I was
Wow.
grateful to be able to come in and share that perspective, because we know that anyone can be groomed. We talk about adults being catfished, which is something that happens quite a bit. Adults are ashamed of talking about it. But if you're a minor, you're still vulnerable. You're still by law able to exert your rights and not be exploited. And we have to really make sure that those narratives don't persist, because we also see a lot of predators saying, well, I thought they were 18, which is just ridiculous. But we've been able to, over time, improve the law. It used to be that, there had to be forced fraud and coercion for children. We got that, taken out. And so we're just continuing to work. But when you talk about the low conviction rates, unfortunately, we look at the numbers that exist today. We see a lot of cases of exploitation trafficking, where they plead out to a lesser crime, because in the majority of human trafficking cases, the one element that stops them from being prosecuted is victim testimony. And the victim is usually terrified, for their lives, their families' lives, and so there's a difficult, task for them. So we advocate strongly on a global scale for an advocate to be with that particular victim throughout that process, provide mental health services, provide support for their families, make sure it's longitudinal. It doesn't just happen during the trial. It's there, for long term, job training. So we're getting better, rates of victims testifying.
The work you're doing, and I think watching that documentary maybe highlighted just how far we've come, and I think we need to keep celebrating some successes, right? Because this is difficult long-term work, and it can be overwhelmingly difficult to stay hopeful. And so I think what you're shining a light on is, through great work like yours, you are actually moving the needle. And that documentary certainly showed me just where we've been coming from. I think when I was growing up, um, exploitation, or some of the old terms which used to be used before trafficking. And by the way, I don't know when it happened, but over the last couple of years I started to notice in the news the term trafficking being used more frequently. I think I had once imagined that that meant people being shipped in a container overseas. Like, I had the term, I wasn't even familiar with that shift, but my understanding is that through some of this work and the evolution of the advocacy is shifting from blaming victims and using terms that might make this seem maybe not what it is, which is systemic exploitation. And this is really important because of the work you're talking about, you're doing, the victims' rights that you're advocating for and you're getting passed. But also now that we're seeing more high profile cases than maybe we did in the past, even stuff that we're hearing about in modern times, the Epsteins and the Diddies, is that this stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are other people involved. And in the case of, elite networks, maybe it's the guise of parties or modeling or business deals. But even I'm thinking way back in the 70s and 80s, someone's going to that gas station bathroom. That door's been locked for an hour, or someone's going to a motel. Someone handed someone the keys. So this is not what I grew up, which was, the proverbial, there's a white van going around playgrounds and stuff. Now it's actually happening in plain sight. And I want to talk about the social media and the internet in a second, but I'm just curious, in terms of these more high profile cases that we've been hearing about, what is your sense of how this is shaping or distorting the public's grasp of this issue?
Well, Mary, back when Jerry Sandusky was arrested, I wrote an article because I really felt that people thought that, Jerry Sandusky being arrested took all sexual predators off the street. And I really wanted to make sure the public understood. So I wrote an article. I said, well, what if this one victim of Jerry Sandusky's never came forward, and Jerry Sandusky moved next door to you and started hanging around your kids? How would you know this guy, I mean, is he assistant coach? Penn State, good reputation. How would you know this guy was a predator? So I really wanted to let people know that this was something that was not isolated. This is very prolific. And I always say that, Epstein and Sandusky are garden variety sexual predators. And there are people out there who are much, much worse, especially when you talk about the dark web. On the dark web, there are pedophile shopping sites where the price of admission is a video of yourself molesting a child. And then once you get into that website, it's like a Walmart of depravity, and they self-publish manuals on how to molest kids. I mean, we've had to go after Amazon and others because let people self-publish these pedophile manuals, who go after, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, because they're traffickers who have books on those sites. So this is very widely practiced. People a year or two ago took down a website that had 90,000 subscribers. And this was a pedophile website. So this is real prolific. Going back to that pedophile shopping site, the youngest age requested for boys was 1. The youngest age requested for girls was 0. So there are people out there who are molesting, infants. And, the FBI and others are playing whack-a-mole when it comes to the dark web, because as soon as one site goes down, another one pops up. So we have to give law enforcement credit and support for going after these people. But this is something that is very prolific, on a global scale. And our best protection is education and understanding, how to protect your kids, because unfortunately with the internet, that really gave these predators, and traffickers direct access to kids.
And this is difficult. This is difficult content, and we're living in a world where we're overwhelmed by information, and we're overwhelmed by distressing information. And so the advocacy and the education that you're doing is so important, because sometimes we just feel like I can't hear something this upsetting. It's just too much. And just for some context, and to grasp the criticality and the enormity of what you're talking about, Jerome, is I think it's estimated 4.8 million people, that's all people, adults, are trafficked globally. And about 1 to 2 million of these are children. And it's very hard to even get more precise numbers on that. But to your point about sexual exploitation and grooming online, just last year, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received something like 30 million reports of online sexual exploitation and grooming. And then since generative AI, they're seeing surges up 1,300%. As overwhelmed as I feel by these numbers, I just feel that we have to pay attention, because as you say, that the cards are stacked against us. We're not talking about the white van and the milk carton anymore. Technology has made this evil efficient and difficult to capture, but it also feels, I don't know, it feels as though almost there's this shift about making some of this normal. And now certainly the dark web is another layer, another depth of depravity that is clearly outside the norm, but those numbers of subscribers just tell you how it's shockingly not as underground as you think. That's a lot of people that are going there. But even things like OnlyFans, right? Or some of the pornography sites, when the internet first came out, that you needed a credit card, there's no age gating, and that material, that content is now accessible to everyone, including, I see, I go to dinner and there's like an 8-year-old with an iPad at the table next door because they want to keep them quiet. If that has internet access and there aren't adult filter controls on that machine, that child can access this content, which now exposes children. No, you know what I mean? The lines are blurred. Yes, the dark web, and also it's almost becoming more normal in the regular web.
And we can't let that happen. We have to keep pushing back against that narrative. And, I'm actively involved in the fight against Pornhub and MindGeek, who just have done these horrific things.
Can you say more about that? Because there's some important stuff happening right now in that.
Right. And with Pornhub, there was no vetting whatsoever of people who were being exploited in these videos. And so this was a deep well of depravity where people could go and access just about any kind of despicable stuff they wanted to look at. My colleagues and I began to push back against this and began to hold them accountable. And they've reduced some of the content on their stream, but we're still working on getting age verification enforced on these websites. I'm also part of a coalition that is working on making sure that these app stores are accountable for the apps that are put on their sites. It's called the App Store Accountability Act. We're working on getting that passed nationally, making sure that these apps don't put kids at risk. So it's all about holding them accountable. And I had the advantage of, working with a coalition many years ago to shut down Backpage.com, which was the world's biggest online brothel. That I think they were making 172 million a year, allowing traffickers to sell adults and kids on their website. And we found that they were complicit in helping these traffickers craft language to circumvent law enforcement. We spent a couple of years because the reason they were getting away with it was there is something called the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, which said that, providers weren't liable for third-party content. So we went to Congress. It was a coalition of survivors, NGOs, congressmen and women, Oracle and other companies, and we finally got this amendment through that allowed Backpage to be shut down. These companies think they can get away with exploiting adults and kids. So Pornhub, we've got their number. This isn't our first rodeo, so we know
Yeah.
exactly what to do. So I had an article I can send you where they actually had this video of a woman that works at Pornhub talking about how a 13-year-old boy being molested on camera was okay. And so I had to speak out. We just have to make sure we push back and say, we're not going to accept this as a standard. This is something that we're not going to let happen, and be vocal, with our congressmen and women in our communities and our churches and synagogues, and make sure that we don't allow this to keep going forward.
The line is definitely moving. I mean, in all type of content, right? I went to see, this is going to show what a geek I am, but Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah.
There was a show of Empire Strikes Back at the New York Philharmonic I went to this week, and I think it was 1980. It was put out, and all you have to do is go back to watch an old film in the 80s or even 90s, just to see how, like, to your point, the line has changed. What we've become desensitized to, sex, violence, all sorts of extreme behavior. We're really, because that desensitization is allowing this shift in norms, I think, that you're describing. And as I'm listening to you and thinking about how someone like me can get involved, it occurs to me that paying attention to this shifting norm and being aware of these laws and that you're trying to get passed, we all have a responsibility here. And I think being informed citizens and paying attention to this stuff is really, really important. This is kind of random, but a couple months ago, there was an earthquake in San Diego, and I think the camera in the San Diego Zoo had captured the moment the earthquake hit. And they have a video of the herd of elephants running to form a circle around the babies. And it just struck me. I mean, I love animals, but it just struck me as that in the animal world, there's this instinctual behavior for the adults, not just the parents, but the adults in the community, or in this case, the herd, to protect the vulnerable. And what can we learn from this, and what can we reflect on whether we're doing a good enough job for that? And so I'm not a parent, so I'm not going to be at children's parties. I'm not a teacher or anything like that. And so I think, one of the questions I was going to ask you, and I'm sort of answering part of it, is like the role someone like me or any other person can play in just being an informed, supportive citizen. Do you have any thoughts?
I do. I mean, and we always say that as a baseline, if you can go and learn the signs of human trafficking, National Human Trafficking Hotline, if you go to their website, or our Trafficking America Task Force website, learn the signs someone's being trafficked, and make that call to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, because they're 24/7, multiple languages, and there's no wrong call. You can also call, or actually you can text or email the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and let them know when you find content that's questionable, or when you have concerns about a child's safety. So there's a lot of ways that you can start, and you can move on from there to volunteering with an organization, writing an op-ed, check in with your local state representative, local representative, your congressional representative, find out what they're working on, and make sure they understand how important this subject is to you as a voter, and encourage them to pass more legislation. And I'll go back real quickly. I just worked on a bill with Congress on artificial intelligence and what we call CSAM, which is child sex abuse material. Artificial intelligence is being used to generate child sex abuse material that's kind of circumventing the law because it's not an actual person, but it's still generated, sex abuse. So we're trying to shut that down. Also, with cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, all these things, that's commonly being used to pay for human trafficking and exploitation. So it's a matter of keeping up the law. But letting your man or woman know that you're concerned about this issue. You can Google what legislation is out there or being proposed, at your state or national level, and get involved with that. And then again, can volunteer with the organization, just become more knowledgeable. And again, that one call can make a huge difference, because what I have to understand is that it may not be one person that's being trafficked, it may be 10 or 20. So if you call in a tip for a person you suspect is being trafficked, then you can bring down, 10 or bring down a ring that's trafficking 10 or 20 people. Now, I just did training in Kazakhstan for the 4 largest airports for personnel there on human trafficking, and I've trained the TSA and others. So it's unfortunate that airports are one of the biggest hubs. Atlanta Hartsfield is one of the biggest hubs in the country, and Delta's done a really good job of promoting education and awareness. They have signs in all the restrooms around the airport. So it's just a matter of learning what it looks like to have someone be trafficked, especially children, because so many, including myself, were taken through airports while they're being trafficked. So again, there's no wrong call, and it's good to get it checked out. And I really give the example of how that one call can make a difference. The largest sex trafficking ring in the U.S. was run in Minneapolis, Minnesota, 24 states, including Canada. There was one routine traffic stop where an officer pulled over 2 young girls in a car, realized they had fake IDs, which is part of the stock and trade in human trafficking. And from that one traffic stop, these 3 generations that had trafficked, young girls was taken down, multi-million dollars. And so just that one call can really begin to unravel these organizations, because a lot of them are just hiding in plain sight. And it's a matter of us, recognizing what's going on and just, letting someone know who can look into this and stop it from going forwards.
It's such an important point, and maybe can we use technology? We've just talked about all the ways technology can enable some of this bad behavior. I'm also hearing like, hey, there's some opportunities for us to use our general connected awareness and technology in a positive way to combat this. Isn't it fair, Jerome, that it used to be you guys would train, obviously, law enforcement, medical personnel, but now, as you're saying, Delta and airports, it's expanded quite a bit into hospitality, which is great. More eyes and ears on the ground looking out for this stuff.
Cable workers, people that work for the cable company, UPS, FedEx, your local mail person, bus drivers, anybody that comes in contact with a child or is out in public and has the ability to look and see, when I train anybody and everybody who is a potential spotter for human trafficking, I have that special place in my heart for nurses because a nurse saved me. So I was honored to be the keynote speaker for the International Association of Forensic Nurses, one of the best conferences I've ever spoken at. And they all just totally got what I was saying. But anybody and everybody has the ability to make a difference. Well, else trust your gut.
Hey there, Mary here. If this conversation sparked something in you, a new perspective, a question, or maybe just a moment of recognition, I'd love it if you hit that subscribe button and share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us reach more people ready to become the change their lives are waiting for. Until next time, keep shifting.